Pollute, a community decision. And we're here tonight from 6 o'clock till 7:30, and it's by the Clean Ocean Foundation. And we've got lots of fantastic speakers for you tonight and a chance for you to ask those questions. So let's kick off by acknowledging for all of us being here, and we're all on, I would say, many different countries of the traditional custodians. And I would like to acknowledge and respect their continuing connection to land, the water, very important, and culture and the contribution that they make to the life of our community. And to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging leaders, and to extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I'm coming from Bunurong country at the moment, and if you would like to add into the chat, please feel free to share what country you're coming and joining us from today. You've got your friendly facilitators from Mosaic Lab. We are here just to help the process along today, help the tech, make sure things run smoothly. So you've got myself and you've got Jodie Kingston, who's here to support you as well. In terms of what we hear about tonight, it really is to improve our understanding on the relationship between ocean pollution and the water cycle and the use of purified, recycled water. In terms of what we're going to do, we're going to hear from a range of marine and environmental experts on their views. And then you've got that chance to ask that one question. So it's not a lot of time tonight. So we're not looking for the long list. We want you to really think about what's that one question you've always wanted to ask around purified, recycled water. In terms of how tonight's going to go, I'm just going to spend a few minutes just up front, just a bit of welcome and working online. We're doing that at the moment. Then we're going to hear a few words from John Gimmel from Clean Ocean Foundation. And then we're going to start off with our first round of speakers. We'll then have a stop point, get quite a few questions from yourselves as we go through, and we'll have about 15 minutes to do a bit of a Q&A. And then it'll be a rinse and repeat. We'll get into our second round of speakers, some different views that we'll hear, and then another Q&A session. And we'd like to finish it off with a quick conversation in small groups around how you move this forward and what you see as the key challenges in that going forward. Finish with a few final words, and we'll be finishing this off at 7:30. In terms of tonight, just to keep this in mind, big group, if you can manage your mute, obviously our speakers will come off. If you haven't got too much noise in the background, it's okay, but we will try and manage it as best we can. We'll be using the chat function for any links and instructions. And if you've got anything to add and you can't access some of the tools we'll give you shortly, you can use the chat. We will monitor it, but just be wary that there's two of us and there's a whole group of you. So we'll try and get onto it as soon as we can. Any help you need if you're in the breakout room, there's a button where you can call for help or just add something in the chat if we're in plenary together. And just virtual patience and presence. Things can and do go wrong. My computer could put itself the other day mid-session, and we just put in a plan in place. We had a backup. I've got the wonderful Jodie here, and I've heard John's been a real fan of facilitation, so I'm sure, John, you'll step in and help us out as we need, but I'm sure we'll go fine today as we head through the session. Just in terms of being online, look after yourself. If you've got to step away quickly, do step away, grab your drinks. But just make sure if you're coming back, just keep your video on as much as you can so people can really connect with the group as they're presenting their ideas. I would now like to welcome John. So John, I'll stop sharing. So John's the CEO of Clean Ocean Foundation, who's putting on tonight. So over to you, John.
Thanks, Lyndall. And thanks everybody for coming. We really appreciate it, and especially our experts, our independent experts. We really appreciate your contribution too. I guess I wanted to sort of start a little bit from Clean Ocean's perspective of how we see things. And I thought the best way to do that was to share a story about my son, who was studying at university, and he's with some friends of his driving a car. They were all university students too, and one of them was asking, but they were asking what their parents do and everything like that, and he was trying to explain what I do, his father does. And one of the things that one of the things that came up was that when he explained it, his fellow student who was a biomedical student, so not silly, said to him, "But hang on a minute, isn't the ocean supposed to be where we put our waste?" And I sort of thought about that, and I thought, well, that's Melbourne 2023. Somebody who's reasonably smart, that's what they think. So from a clean ocean point of view, these conversations are really important because they're not actually things that get spoken about very much in the media. And I'm sure if any of you have tried to get something in the media, you know how drowned out things like this get. So this opportunity here tonight is about that. And one of the things that we want as Clean Ocean is people to start thinking about, well, what are our options? Can, with purified recycled water, can we reduce ocean and river pollution? So hopefully we'll all learn something about that today, because decisions will have to be made in the future, and some of them may be quicker than others, depending on which state we're in. In Victoria, we have an eastern treatment plant that produces very high quality water, so close to being arguably purified recycled water, it's not even funny. But the decision makers that we have to influence are concerned that purified recycled water lacks social license. Now, what is social license, and how do we get it? And I think that's something that we can consider as we go on this path. And one of the things that is key to us with social license is how we look at the ocean. So I just wanted to show you something that we've put together as far as what we'd like to see in an ideal world. And as you can see, that's our idea of the urban water cycle. And one of the things is we would like to push society towards thinking about the sustainable model, which doesn't necessarily rely so much on manufactured water from a more desalination plants, because when we make more water from a desalination plant, we use more water, then we discharge more water into the sea. So we actually create more pollution. Whereas if we actually recycle water, we create less pollution, less we have to manage that goes into the sea. So that's basically the world according to us. When you think about what the experts say today, and when you're thinking about your questions, just ask yourself the question in the background: if purified recycled water can reduce ocean pollution and river pollution, what can we do to make our decision makers understand that it's a conversation we need to have? So thanks, Lyndall. Hand it back to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, John. So that's a real gauntlet to throw down. What can we do to help that be a decision-making based conversation as well? All right, so let's start to think about who we're going to hear from. So we're going to hear from our first round of speakers. But before we do, we want to provide an opportunity for you to think of the questions as they're going through and giving their presentations. So I've got Jodie who's going to pop in the chat a link to Group Map. This is just like an online butcher's paper, I should say. Click on the link, open it, and it'll ask for your email or your name. Just pop it in there. It's just so we can see who's coming in, and you will get a site like this. This is where you can capture all your questions as we go through. So I can see some people coming in now. You just click on the plus, and then you add the name of the presenter that you'd like to ask the question to, and then your question. It'll just help us navigate a little bit to who the question's directed at. So we will keep this going throughout the 9. You can keep adding questions. You can like other people's questions. If a question has a lot of likes, we're going to go to that one. So if there's something that you really think is worthwhile exploring, you can hit like. Unfortunately, speakers, you can't then dislike it, so we don't ask you, but we'll work on the community to ask you the like. All right, if anyone's having trouble getting in, I can see there's a few people in now, but make sure you click on that link If you do struggle a bit, you can add a question into the chat and we can pick it up and put it in the group map for you. All right, let's look at our first round of speakers. So first up, we've got Dr. Simon Toes. We've got Professor Andrea Gaynor, I should say, sorry. And we've got John Boone. So what we will do, they've got 4 minutes each, and you'll hear me chime in. They know towards the end, and they've got 30 seconds to go. We'll make sure we keep people to it so we do get to hear from everyone. And I'd like to start now by introducing Simon. And if you're happy to just start off, Simon, we're looking forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Thank you, Lindell, and welcome everybody. My name's Simon Toes. I am a microbiologist by training, and I've spent close to 25 years working on water recycling, particularly around water quality and the sustainability. So I'm going to try and fit 25 years of my work into 4 minutes. So you can imagine it's going to be a bit of fun. Essentially, I started in Western Australia when Western Australia realised that there was a serious problem with the lack of rain in Western Australia. And then that was accentuated by the work of South Australia becoming drier and drier, and they started on that process as well. And then Queensland also came in with the Millennium Drought. So all three of those states have been very heavy in water recycling and moving towards purified recycled water. And I produced a fair bit of research into that, particularly around the area of safety, because we know that with water recycling, safety is a big issue. It's a major part of everybody's concerns, particularly around pathogens and chemicals of concern. And that's been my research. And we've been taking that, and in fact, the research that myself and others have done has been used by a large proportion of the rest of the world as a guide. And Australia is a leader in water sustainability and water recycling through what the researchers in Australia have done. In the process as well, a number of us were involved in bringing together the new Australian water recycling guidelines. Previously, Australian guidelines were ad hoc, state-based. They were done by just trying to find chemicals and pathogens, and we're not very well doing on that. And as a result, and it was piecemeal across all the states. So this brought it together as an Australian-based process that worked really well across everything. And so what we actually now know through using the water recycling guidelines and all the research that comes in is that what we can do is we can actually control the water recycling through this risk management approach that the guidelines bring in, which means that we can actually control the treatment by what we want to bring all the risk down to what is below an acceptable risk. And the acceptable risk we use in Australia is less than what we would consider may happen from normal day-to-day activities, from coming in contact with water, coming in contact with food, coming in contact with a whole range of other people, and sickness that you get. If you're like me and you sent your children to daycare, or as I like to call them, viral exchange centres, you're going to come across pathogens in those. So what we found and what we've worked on is the fact that the more you treat water, the more that you have with potential contact with recycled water, the more we treat it. And we've done a lot of research on how that treatment works and making sure there's built-in redundancy in that process. And then if you don't need that level of treatment because of less requirement for exposure, say it's irrigation out of crops, we don't need to treat as well. And we've been able to manage it through that process. And in doing so, we've actually found that we can set up water recycling schemes, and all the water recycling schemes are now set up in a way that we can actually control the risk. So we now know that the risk from pathogens and chemicals is extremely low, and that really it comes down to how to get that information across. Thank you. How to get that information on the research that shows how low the risk actually is. And the risk is exceedingly low from pathogens and chemicals when it's done correctly, and how to get that across, because it's really the social license, it's the community acceptance, the community understanding that becomes worth it. And that's where I'm actually going to go, because that's 20 years in 4 minutes. So hopefully I'll have some questions where I can answer the bits that I haven't been able to fit in. So thank you, Lyndall.
Well done. I think you've even given 10 seconds to somebody else. So I'm not going to take that up, but well done, Simon. You've thrown down the gauntlet. I'd like to now welcome Dr. Andrea Gaynor to come off mute and to share a little bit with us as well. And just remember, don't forget, if you've got a question as you hear them talking, please add it into that group map.
Cheers. Thanks very much, Lyndall. I'm coming to you from Menang Noongar country in beautiful southwestern Australia. And I'm an environmental historian, and I've just co-authored a book on the history of water in Australian cities. So I'm really drawing on this recent environmental history research to talk to you today. And I think the main argument I wanted to make, or the main perspective I want to present, is that from quite early in its history, Australia's maintained an essentially colonial attitude to water. So by that I mean a kind of outlook of endless expansion and exploitation of new water sources and disposal of wastes wherever we like, as opposed to water reuse or conservation. So I think really the core assumption is that all of the water sources are available for use by humans, and particularly by settler Australians, without much regard for Indigenous needs or attitudes. So even with this belief that every water source is available for us to exploit for our purposes, that process of providing centralised high quality water supplies to almost all urban Australians has been challenging at times. So there's several examples of failures in these systems where quality has been compromised. But by and large, Australians have come to expect that water will be available, it will be available in abundance, and it will be available from sources that they perceive as pure. So historically in Australia, when water supplies for a city have run low, this hasn't been portrayed as a problem of overconsumption or a problem of exceeding environmental constraints. Instead, it's been seen as a problem of insufficient supply and inadequate infrastructure. So the framing is really important. Different kind of groups and different solutions are summoned depending on how you think about the nature of the problem. So if you think about our water issues as a problem of marine pollution, you summon a quite different kind of solution than you do if you think about it being a problem of inadequate or impure supply. But almost invariably, the immediate response historically has been to restrict water use in order to share the remaining supplies, and the ultimate solution is seen to lie in expanding capacity to extract or make more potable water via dams, rivers, groundwater, or desalination. So desalination, of course, is the most recent technology to come on the scene, and it seems to be the solution to all our problems. It's infinitely expandable, as the ocean's pretty big. But of course, there's the energy cost in an era when we must reduce energy consumption, as well as those big problems of ocean pollution that we're hearing more about today. So water recycling has actually been used in Australia for many, many years, but not generally for potable water. So instead, as I'm arguing, Australians have become really accustomed to thinking that we could just keep supplementing our existing potable water supplies with new dams, more river water, or more groundwater. So that's that colonial growth mentality. But these usual solutions, the new dams, new bores, new desal, have just, I think, served to postpone the vulnerability or create other problems, rather than offering truly sustainable solutions. So now we see that increasingly recycled or purified water is on the agenda, but it's politically difficult because of this expectation that voting Australians have developed that their drinking water will come from those sources we perceive as pure, and that doesn't include purified wastewater or stormwater. So like Simon said, I think this is partly an issue of education. On the one hand, people don't understand the environmental and economic consequences of continually developing new water sources. And on the other hand, people don't understand that they're already drinking water that is recycled. I mean, that's what the natural water cycle does. So we now have the technology to achieve those same ends in a different way. Also, the barrier isn't surmountable. Since 2011, when a trial program was implemented, Perth people have been drinking purified water through an aquifer recharge program. And I think the groundwater phase of that process might help to reduce the so-called yuck factor, as people can believe that this is nature doing its purifying work. But as far as I know, there's no reason why a dam recharge system couldn't work in a similar way. After all, dams are used to store desalinated water that's destined for Perth customers as drinking water. So to sum up, as an environmental historian, my conclusion is that we need to abandon that colonial mentality that we can keep taking over new water sources and putting our pollution where we like. Instead, we need to adopt a more responsible approach that sees us learning to live within limits and caring for the biosphere that maintains us. And that includes water conservation and water reuse. Thank you very much. And I look forward to our discussion later.
Fantastic. Thanks, Andrea. And look, if you've got any questions for Andrea, make sure you add it in to the group map. All right. John, I'd like to invite you to come off your mute, please.
Okay.
And we'd like to now hear from John Poon.
All right. Thank you. I'll just share I've actually prepared a couple of slides, so I'll share those right now. I've got the right one. Well, thanks for the invitation today to speak. A little bit about me is that I started my journey on recycled water something like 23 years ago when I arrived in Singapore to lead up all the foundational work that sat in behind what is now known as their New Water program. New Water being the name that they give to purified recycled water in Singapore. Yeah, they've got a bit of branding going on there. And here is just a couple of pictures of the work that we managed to complete while I was over there for a few years. And I was actually quite glad to report yesterday was the 20th anniversary of New Water going public in Singapore. So that's quite a milestone in purified recycled water. I think that sort of passed us by here in Australia, but I know in Singapore there'd be a number of people who have been paying attention to that. New Water is now the cornerstone of Singapore's water supply system, and it's very significant. It's about 30% of the daily water needs of Singapore at the moment. So yeah, and look, and you talk about social license. There's a lot of effort put into building visitor centres and a public education system as well around water cycle management. So I think if you ever get a chance to go to Singapore and you have a little bit of spare time, please drop by and have a look at the New Water Visitor Centre. I think it's hit about 4 million people visitation. So I wish I had ticketing rights for that, but sadly no. So the next slide, I'll just go back. No talk about treatment processes and would go, has to have an awesome diagram like this, right? And it's a complicated diagram, I admit, but what this is it's a spectrum diagram. It's showing the particle spectrum for things like what Simon was talking about, pathogens and microbes, all the way through to atomic things and salts and all those sorts of things there. So on the right-hand side there, you've got things that are visible to the naked eye, and all the way to the left are things that are at the atomic scale, and you'll need assistance from special electron microscopes to actually look at that. But what I wanted to draw your attention to was these three regions here in the blue and the orange here that I've marked out. Those spectrums there are really of great interest to us because they're the spectrums that new technologies has enabled us to start removing these particles as well. And that's the kind of breakthrough, as you could say, that has allowed us to make purified recycled water, especially on the scale of what Singapore is doing at the moment. Traditionally, we've only been able to get to the right-hand side of particle filtration, sand filters and all that sort of stuff. As you can see, it's going to be totally inadequate for making the water that we want and the safe recycled water that we want as well. So moving on to the next slide. Here is a couple of pictures of what I call the classic dual membrane separation technologies that we use to create purified recycled water. There's microfiltration, ultrafiltration, reverse osmosis, and ultraviolet light disinfection. These three technologies allow us to make purified recycled water. And how that goes together, well, we put these technologies or these treatment processes in series, and they operate kind of like this. So we have what I call used water, using the same words that I guess the Singaporeans use, but I kind of like that rather than using the word of treated effluent and all that sort of stuff. But in used water, we have a lot of these contaminants in there as well. And you can see in there how we string those processes together. There's overlapping treatment barriers there that allow us to remove things that we don't want in the recycled water. A long story short, this kind of treatment process is very comprehensive contaminant removal. It does rely on physical and chemical processes to do that. Unfortunately, it does make a very significant reject stream that we have to dispose of. And that's quite contentious. And it's about 30% of the water coming in that has to be, that is not usable. And this is the most commonly used process. But there's good news. There is alternative processes, and I think John mentioned that we're using advanced oxidation processes at Eastern Treatment Plant, and it's a very good example of the application of this technology. And again, this technology can be strung together. We have ozone with BAC filters or biologically activated carbon filters together with UV disinfection, and we can produce just about comparable water to the membrane separation processes. The only differences being is that we have a lot less reject to look after, which is great, but it also means that we have a salt level that is preserved or conserved in the system as well. And that's something that it's a technical nuance that needs to be discussed. I wanted to also talk about the opportunities we see coming up going into the future.
15 seconds, John.
Yep. And I'm just about there. So yeah, and we have lots of opportunities around where do we take recycled water in the future. You know, we're great about the drinking stuff, but I also think there's a lot to do around the industrial area as well, and in particular around how do we actually decarbonize ourselves and get ourselves off fossil fuels, which is where the hydrogen area goes in as well. And maybe if we could discuss that a little bit later on. And the other area that we're really encouraging is to see is that water authorities like Goulburn Valley Water are starting to have that conversation with their customers as well. And I think this is really important to start talking about what part do they play in the circular economy, and how do we start to close off these materials and energy loops that we've got in our systems as well with our infrastructure. Back to you, Lyndall.
All right. Thanks, John. Well done. You got through your slides and some great graphics and visuals there as well. Thank you. All right. So I'm just going to take on that sharing, if that's okay, John. Thank you.
Go for it.
So we've just got a bit of a Q&A now. So before we do that, we should give a bit of a round of applause for Dr. Simon Tose, Dr. Andrea Gaynor and John Poon. So well done, everyone. You did excellent job. So now in terms of questions, so this is where we turn our eye to the group map. And I can see that there's a few questions in there already. And the first one that actually came in, it was from a fellow speaker, but we'll let that go. Simon, there's a question around, aren't we already drinking recycled water?
Yes, and in fact, Andrea did point that out to a certain extent that we are drinking recycled water. And I think some of the people who, as Andrea said, have that mindset that we are drinking absolutely pure water would be rather upset if they realise that most water runs down our rivers and streams and collects different contaminants from towns that are coming down, from agriculture, industry, before it comes in, and then it's treated and nobody's falling sick. And yet the purified recycled water is actually treated to even better standards than our drinking water needs to be treated to and is treated to. So we do, and yet we still function very, very well. So all that's been discussed here is actually just continuing to close that loop.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. All right, I'm going to the people that have got names next to them at the moment, but we will get through some of these other questions as well. John, there's a question around where do microplastics fit on your spectrum slide?
They're probably a little bit, I don't want to go back to the slide, but they probably fit just above the bacteria and protozoa, probably in that area there, probably a little bit smaller than sand in that area there, probably still visible to the eye. And the technologies that we've got, we can certainly remove those as well. Especially any of the filtration technologies are quite effective at removing those particles.
Thanks, John. All right. I'm going to ask Simon, so let's hear some of your voices. Simon Tannock, you've got a question here about the treatment train. And I'm wondering if you want to ask your question and ask it to the person you'd like to answer it.
Yeah, hi, thanks very much. I'm not probably really sure. It's probably going to go to John Poon. In regards to the treatment train, you've highlighted the filtration and through to UV.
Yeah.
But then I presume there's some form of storage, whether it, reservoir storage and things like that.
Yes.
Do most of these systems go through that initial UV to a storage, an open system storage? So I guess it gets a bit of sunlight and a bit of exposure to what we would call, normal nature before going back into systems. And are there any issues around problems within those storages, like blue-green algal blooms or other issues with E. coli or anything once the water, that treated water gets to those storages?
It's kind of a shame, isn't it, to go all to that much trouble to make such clean water and using those great technologies to do that, and then to put that water back into an open storage and allow things like that to interact with nature and dirty up again, so to speak. Speaking from experience, I mean, in Singapore in particular, a lot of the water is actually, they don't allow it to go to the reservoir. It goes directly to industry, and it's actually preferred by industry. I mean, Singapore has a lot of manufacturing still, and they have advanced manufacturing as well. And advanced manufacturing, would you believe it, is highly water intensive. Yeah, the computer chips and the computer servers we're using today would have required a lot of water to make those, to make today's call possible. Yeah, computer chips are highly water intensive. It's quite amazing to think about it. I think that the number that was given to me is about 2,000 to 3,000 litres of water required to make one fairly complex computer chip as well. Yeah, makes your eyes water, doesn't it? To think it's that water intensive to do that. But and look, I think it's a perception thing that people want to put it into some form of storage outside, some sort of natural storage as well. In my books, I think that barrier is probably not really needed at this stage. And if you've been to Singapore, you can watch people drink new water from a bottle. They actually, as a public education bit or acceptance bit, they actually bottle the water and give it out for free, and you can do what you want with it. And they're pretty confident about it as well.
Thanks, John. I'm just going to put a call out to people. If you've got your videos off, now's the time to bring your videos on so we can see your faces. It's always nice with a bit of a Q&A to see people's faces. I've got some other questions here, and Andrea, I'm going to just go out on a limb and pick one of these and see if it's something that works within your field as well. But it was about, where is the reject water disposed and the pollution issues with reject water? What happens with the reject side of it?
Oh, I think that's probably best answered by one of our more technical people, and it probably depends on the situation. I couldn't actually answer that for Western Australia, sorry.
That's okay. So let's throw it open to John and Simon if we can help out at all. Got an answer to that question?
I'll have a go at it. Yeah, look,
John.
I did mention in my talk, it is a contentious point. Those membrane separation processes that I talked about do create quite a significant brine stream. About 30% of what goes in ends up as a brine stream. Yes, at the moment, I think the best solution is to the ocean at the moment. So it's not really solving our problem at the moment, but there are new technologies coming. And I think this is the discussion. If we are going to do very significant amounts of water recycling, we need to think very carefully about the brine stream as well. And I think, John was quite right. Hit the nail on the head in terms of the Eastern treatment plant. I kind of like that treatment process around the advanced oxidation processes, because the brine stream is very little. It's quite manageable, and I think, and we could even look at how we could manage that small brine stream with other technologies as well to create what I would call a zero liquid discharge treatment plant. And I think that's the future as well, is going to zero liquid discharge and completely close the water cycle loop as well.
Okay.
So yeah, look, we've had 20 years with the current technologies. The next 20 years, I hope we go to zero liquid discharge.
Thanks, John. Simon, would you add anything to that at all? I could see you going for your mute button. So anything to add?
No, I think it is the main issue we're dealing with, in the fact that, as John said, we still create what's called the reverse osmosis concentrate, or ROC in most cases. There's a few places more inland in Australia where they may discharge, like Alice Springs was looking at it and discharging that out into the desert where it could evaporate. But most cities on the sea actually discharge either into a river that flows into the sea or out to sea, with the idea that we get dilution, but it's not solving the problem. And there's been research on it, but as John said, maybe the next 20 years.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Thank you.
Can I jump in there, Lyndall? That's
Sure can.
We're kind of quite pushy about that. You know, when we discuss recycled water and social license, you know, one of the decisions people may well make is say, well, we don't want this, but we'd be happy with that. And then when you start to talk about the cost, it starts to get interesting. And I'm sure John could back me up with this, that we did some number crunching with another engineer on what if we did another process for the Eastern Treatment Plant, and it was a pittance. It was like roughly $60 million to get it to the stage where it'd tick every single box. And I think John was saying, oh, you don't need to do that. And it's kind of like, it's that close. But the issue is these decisions do open up horizons for us. And obviously, especially with rivers and stuff like that, where you've got an inland circumstance where you can't discharge to the ocean, then those other processes are, you know, probably far more popular right now.
Okay, thanks, John. So Robert, we've got a question from you on PFAS and medications in recycled water. Is this you, Rob?
Yes, that's right. PFAS and medications in recycled water.
And you're wanting to know what?
I do. Does the current processes remove PFAS and medications from water?
Okay. Who would like to handle that one, Simon?
I can, because this is an area we did a fair bit of research in Queensland into. So we looked into common medications. We looked into less common medications, and we also looked into the cancer drugs, particularly as there was a lot of concern around the high level of the cytotoxic drugs. What we found was that virtually 95% of the common medications, antibiotics, hormone drugs, get actually broken down in wastewater treatment processes. So that's the normal common wastewater treatment plants that exist everywhere at the moment in our cities, remove somewhere between 70 and 95% of those medications. There's a few that are very resistant, particularly some of the psychiatric drugs. In fact, they make wonderful markers when you're doing research into aquifers and stuff. They make wonderful markers because they don't break down. But at the same time, then they come into what John was showing, the advanced water treatment train, the membrane filtrations, the reverse osmosis, the advanced oxidation with peroxide. And then we're finding that the removals were down to 99 point whatever removal. So we found that most drugs are removed even before they get to the advanced water treatment plants to levels where you'd have to drink something like 20 litres of treated wastewater a day to actually have any effect on you. And that was a day for about 50 years. We did those sorts of calculations. So we just couldn't find anything. We found it was so difficult for the drugs. We actually had to concentrate so much water to actually detect them. We ran out of. Cytotoxic drugs actually are an interesting one because there's just not enough that goes into such a large volume of wastewater that, in fact, we could never detect cytotoxic drugs in the raw wastewater, let alone anywhere else. So eventually we stopped looking for those just because there's just not enough and it's diluted so much. PFAS is the one that I probably not so qualified to talk about, because it's only started to come in when we were actually looking at the end of the research that we were doing in Queensland at the time. The one thing was that we found that it was being removed to a certain extent in the wastewater treatment plants. By the time it came through the reverse osmosis, we really just were struggling to detect PFAS at all, to the extent that it was present in higher amounts in the drinking water that we were using in the control than the reverse osmosis. And I've gone back and had a look occasionally at the literature, and it seems like reverse osmosis, there's still some things around it they're working around about calcium and magnesium and the types of membranes and pressures that still need to be worked out. But I think the reverse osmosis membranes are showing to be quite efficient in removing them. And people are saying, oh, well, we're still finding it in the aquifer here, but because PFAS is so ubiquitous, it's coming from so many sources. To say it's coming from recycled water versus something else is really, really difficult. And I think there's a lot of people doing it. The only thing to add on to that is one of the really cool bits of research we did is we did what's called cytotoxicity with cells. And we actually looked at all the processes through the recycled water process. In fact, we found that the cytotoxicity in the recycled water when it came out of the plant was equivalent to or less than the drinking water that we were using. And as soon as we put it back into the reservoir, which was back into Wivenhoe Dam, or we used Wivenhoe Dam as it's going in there, the cytotoxicity rose again. So that comes back to what John was saying. We're actually probably polluting the recycled water by putting it back in the dam.
Okay. Thanks, Simon. That was a very detailed response, and hopefully that's really helped as well. Okay, I think we've got time for one more question, and I'm just, Paul Harvey, just let me know if I've got this right based on what you've captured there. I think your question is, how can we ensure that recycled water poses low risk to human health? Did I capture that okay, Paul? Just checking I've got your question right.
But to refine it slightly further, given the significant absences of data in the drinking water guidelines and the recycled water guidelines in terms of threshold criteria, how can statements be made that the water quality is sufficient and pose little to no risk to human health?
Okay, great. Thanks, Paul. Who would like to tackle that question?
Oh, well, Simon, the water quality stuff is you, but maybe I could have a quick stab at that one as well. I mean, from the treatment processes, we're pretty confident. We are able to control our treatment processes and monitor them. And, you know, we've had good 20 plus years now at it. So we've developed quite good operational regimes and risk management frameworks to do that. And Simon has sort of mentioned some of those as well. And I think we're pretty good at making good product. But then, yeah, the stuff that Simon talks about as well is probably, you know, around the pathogens and the PFAS and all that sort of stuff. And I guess what is low risk? Is it acceptable risk you're talking about there? What is acceptable? And yeah, I think that's probably the way to frame it.
Thanks, John. I'll give you a minute, Simon, to add to that. You got anything to add?
Okay, yeah, just that, yeah, we work to an acceptable risk. There's never anything such as low risk. That cytotoxicity experiment that I mentioned, it's been repeated by people, showing that we are removing anything that is causing to cell lines that we commonly use. Also, they went through and they did some analysis of just the organics that are getting through by various chemical analyses, and they were showing that the only organics they were picking up were very, very low levels of natural organic matter that exist everywhere, what we call the humics and the fulvics. And again, we're just removing things. So there's always the unknown unknowns, and where do we call it? And as somebody said, a chemist once said, we can measure things down to billions of a particle, and the amount of those chemicals and pathogens are so low that the risks are so low that they're less than what we're dealing with in our normal drinking water situation at the moment.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Yep. And look, did I just add on to that? I mean, we've had 20, 25 years worth of experience now in Singapore on that. We haven't caused, the sky hasn't fallen in yet. And certainly using that kind of water in billion-dollar computer chip manufacturing processes, we haven't nuked one of them yet as well. So it's pretty good record so far.
So it's looking at some other examples of what's happening around the world as well. Yeah, Thanks, John. All right, let's keep going because we are moving on to our next round of speakers. So this time I would like to invite, my screen's not moving. We've got Associate Professor Ian Wright. We've got Associate Professor Laurie Lawrenson. We've got Dr. Boyd Blackwell, and we've got Sarah Jo Lobween. All right, so first up, again, just a reminder, use the group map. Please, if you can, think about a question for the speakers and just write their name in, which helps a little bit, but we can also openly ask it as well. It's the same group map and we'll see new questions come up. All right, this is just a reminder, I'm going to hand it over to you, Ian.
Thanks very much, Lyndall. Can everyone hear me okay? It's lovely to be part of this conversation. Thanks for the thumbs up. I've changed my notes several times since I started. Thank you very much, everyone that's spoken before me, and great questions. I'm in Sydney, the land of the Darug people, and my base degree is agriculture. I'm a water scientist that studies biota of rivers. And I started my career in a less than glamorous way, wading around the sewage that was discharged into Blue Mountains waterways. Sometimes I felt like I had to burn my clothes afterwards. But what do we need to do? We are in the driest inhabited continent. So much of our water, when it falls, comes down all at once. Much evaporates or soaks into the ground. We have the lowest rainfall coefficient on average. So we really, really need this stuff. My question to everyone is, when do we make these decisions about investing more in water conservation and purified recycled water? Because my experience in one of the big urban centres is that public discourse and the big decisions are often made in a crisis. That's when most of the decisions made on embracing desalination or water restrictions, if you like. I see the difference with particularly Perth and Adelaide, particularly Perth, which really is always in a crisis. But we've got to take people with us. I find it fascinating, the relationship between humans and water. And I just look up, one of my favourite websites is Bureau of Meteorology Water Dashboard. Have a look at it if you like. Sydney's got 95%. Its storages are 95% full. Melbourne's 95% full. Canberra's 99.7. I'd say that means we're about 95% asleep, because we're always in a crisis and we need to be investing right now, because we have a very fraught relationship with water. Here in Sydney, there are 3 giant ocean outfalls. I call them the ocean outfalls of opportunity. That's Manly, Bondi, and Malabar. These are the 3 biggest primary treated, that's one of the lowest levels of sewage treatment, outfalls in the country. And I thank Clean Oceans for putting all this data together so that we can get a national view. Yet just around the corner is the Kurnell desalination plant. Now, it's much more energy intensive getting that salt out of water than it would be to treat these ocean outfalls of opportunity. Now, I know Sydney Water's looking at that, but it is all about community acceptance. We need to take the community with us. So here in Sydney, the attention really is all about flooding, and the talk has all been about raising Warragamba Dam wall so that the developers can build on flood-prone land down on the Hawkesbury floodplain. Yet we really should be looking at how we can sensibly use water more than once. Why do we flush our toilets with perfectly good potable drinking water. So
30
Sydney had,
seconds.
thank you, Sydney had a scheme of purple pipes where people had recycled water to wash the car, flush the toilet, water the lawn. And we're doing it. Warragamba, where do you think the effluent from? Lithgow, Goulburn, Southern Highlands, there's 4 treatment plants. North Richmond, in dry times, about 20% of their water supply is treated sewage. So we need to take the community with us, and we need to make data available. We're always in crisis, and our journey to sustainability, we have a long way to go. Thank you. Thanks, Lyndall.
Thank you. Well done, Ian. Thank you for that. And I think you've raised some really good questions there also to really ponder around some examples of what's already happening. Any questions again, please pop it into the group map. And I would like to start the next speaker, who is Associate Professor Laurie Lawrenson. So
Hi,
Laurie,
everybody.
just checking you're there. Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that. I've had IT problems, which makes my life really difficult. I'll start off by thanking everybody. Lots of interesting things there. I'll say that my background is marine science. I've done a whole lot of marine habitat mapping. I've done fisheries type work. So where I sit on this thing is at the point where material is being thrown into the ocean. So I'll reiterate what was said earlier before I lost the connection, and that was that we continue to think of the ocean as a dumping point that will absorb everything we can throw at it. This has been proven to be not the case, but I don't think that it has been listened to well enough. There's this, and again, maybe this was said earlier, but I missed out some of it. There's this notion of the tragedy of the commons, where essentially there are places or things that we can do that don't cost us any sort of financial or personal, either money or whatever it is, to dispose of or use. And the ocean is that big commons where, at the moment, we can dispose of our unwanted waste. Now, from a marine ecosystem point of view, because of climate change and all those things that are going on, those systems are horrendously, or going to be horrendously, more stressed over time. And wherever we have these processes where we're going to dispose of waste, no matter what quantity they are, they're adding more to an already stressed system. And that in itself is the big problem. I'm in Southwest Victoria. We have a very high energetic coastline, but hopefully not stepping out of line. Our water authority feels that because we have a high energetic coastline, we don't really need to treat that much. Australia's coastline is vast. So you've got places like West Australia where you've got areas of extensive sand where you're going to have a different sets of biological imperatives that we would have to deal with when we discard material, whatever it is. In Victoria, we have a different set. For example, we have large kelp forests. Now, those kelp forests are already hugely stressed by climate change, particularly temperature. But you start throwing extra things at it, then things start falling over and you start getting cascading effects. So losing kelp means you lose reproductive habitat for fish, you lose habitat for invertebrates. The whole system switches to a different state, which we may like, we may not like. But our ability to rehabilitate it is very, very questionable. The thing that struck me listening to a lot of what's being said is that in the marine environment, when we are discarding things, the level of research that goes into the fate of the things that are going in there and the consequences to ecosystems are not being followed through properly.
30 seconds.
So we have a long way to go for us to understand what is happening. And until we know that, we're not going to be able to deal with the marine consequences properly. Just remember, Western Australia, you've got sand, rock, around the southwest coast, more rock, different types of habitat, short continental shelves. You get to Victoria, short high energy, lots of interesting things, huge biotic diversity. You go up to the Queensland, you've got coral reefs. All of these things have different sensitivities. And if we're going to put things in the oceans, we have to get a much better understanding of what those consequences are. And in my view, we don't have that yet. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Laurie. Appreciate that. And you kept time. Thank you. Some really good things to think about. Okay, your next speaker. We're doing really well. We're nearly getting through, but I'd like to now welcome Dr. Boyd Blackwell to come off your mute and to share your thoughts.
Thanks, Lyndall. I'll just share, can everyone see my PowerPoint or not? Lyndall, I might get you to share my PowerPoint, so that's all right.
Yeah, give me 2 seconds. I can do that. You start talking and I will get there.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to, thanks very much. Thanks, Clean Ocean Foundation, for getting us together. John, Peter, your hard work over the years. I think we're making great gains with this group and the policy, reforms that you're suggesting to clean up our oceans, to provide us with better ecosystems for our coastal communities, but also our inland communities as well. Lyndall, have you still got me?
Yes, I'm on your slide number 1.
Oh, excellent, thank you. Could you move down to slide 2, please?
You tell me when to stop. Can you see me?
Sorry about that. I'm just
breaching limits.
Let me go back into Zoom. Oh, great. Thanks. Sorry. Up to slide 1. Sorry. Thank you. Just, and this relates to what Laurie spoke about previously, but also in terms of some of the previous speakers about, the impacts on our biophysical environments that receive wastewater. So it links in with those elements. So again, like Laurie, I'm a bit focused on the end of the cycle, but inevitably there's all sorts of economic and social and governance problems, as we know from Clean Ocean Foundation's policy prescriptions, with the way that we look after the whole life cycle of water, isn't there? But in terms of the outfalls themselves, the way that we manage water, we're moving what's called from an empty world to a full world. So we're converting our natural capital to man-made capital. And as a result of that, on this diagram on the right, we're making the economy a much larger part of our total biosphere. And we're replacing natural capital with man-made capital. As a result, the ecosystem services which our natural environment can provide us are becoming quite small. This is on the bottom section to the full world, and we're relying more heavily on the economic services provided by built environments. And then as we're moving to a fuller world, we move we have this entropy throughput, which is the second law of thermodynamics. So we're moving from a level of high usefulness to low usefulness, and that's inevitably what we do as humans in our production and consumption. And this comes from some of the work of Jodorowsky-Rojan, but also Herman Daly. And this is the foundation for what's considered ecological economics. So we have this problem with our world in the sense of entropy throughput. And while recycling may help, inevitably, as we consume more matter and energy and fill our world, we also will have a significant impact on our ecosystems, our oceans, and our waterways. Next slide, please, Lyndall. We're also filling or breaching a number of our limits in terms of the capacity of our oceans and waterways to act as sinks. We've talked a little bit today about toxins, the microplastics, etc. But importantly, also our oceans and our atmosphere have the limits that they can assimilate these things have been breached. And this is part of the work of Stefan et al. In 2015. Next slide, please, Lyndall. Importantly, the third point I'd like to make is that the way that we manage this whole system of water use and disposal is unethical I think this is fundamentally why COF exists, is because we see the wrong that's done by parts or parts of our communities. For example, the wastewater from Melbourne CBD being disposed in other localities or in the backyards of other communities. And inevitably across the globe, we see that movement of waste moves from the haves to the have-nots. So those who can least afford it and who need to receive well-being and welfare from ecosystem services. But as we degrade those ecosystems, including our coasts, oceans, etc., with wastewater and high levels of wastewater, then we're placing a much larger burden on those who can least afford it. So there's this current generational inequity that's associated with it, unethical, but also intergenerational inequity too, in terms of entropy throughput, in terms of what Georgescu, Rojan and Daly were talking about. So that's the fundamental problem with human growth and our continued need for, to grow our populations, but also inherently to grow our water use. And we can become more efficient with our water use, but inevitably we will consume more water as our population grows, and we will begin to fill more of our world with man-made capital rather than relying on the ecosystem goods and services of our national environments. Last slide, please, Lyndall. And then finally, fourth point I'd like to make is that upgrading is actually showing, even if we revert back to classical economics, the upgrades make sense. Some of the work we did from moving from primary and secondary to tertiary, we found that the net benefits to Australians are between 12 and 28 million. I suppose the next step here, if we wanted to just look at classical economics, would be, what's the movement from tertiary to potable? But again, just be conscious of this concept of entropy throughput, in that it isn't necessarily a circular system in terms of the flow of matter and energy through an ecosystem. And that's been clearly made that point has been clearly identified by Georgescu, Rojan and Daly and other ecological founding parents of ecological economics. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Boyd. Appreciate that. All right, we're on to our final speaker. I'd like to invite Sarah Jo LeBuin to come off mute and to just share your final thoughts.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. It helps me to stay on point rather than, oh, sorry, I don't know why. Sorry, let me go to the very beginning.
Oh, good. I can see it nice and clearly.
Yep. Sorry, I did have it on the first thing. I got too busy.
Oh, good.
You've all got a preview now. Okay.
We're getting a preview. It looks good.
That's right. So I'll try to keep this very quick. My point of view is from a community stance. I am a marine scientist and a teacher, but my support of recycled water has actually come through picking up plastics. So that has led us to an understanding of how our current treatment of sewage has led me to believe that recycled water has to be our next plan of attack, especially down where I live, which is in Sutherland Shire. So we started off collecting data from our big cleanups, and there were some obvious things like we might find black straws where they were sold in a cafe nearby. But the thing I want to talk about today is stuff that we found that was coming, and we proved that was coming from sewage after being told by our local water sewage treatment plants that no, possibly they're not coming from our sewage, but we proved that they were. So we've found a lot of white sticks. Some had actual indentations that were 5 millimeters or 6 millimeters. Some had fat, oil and grease. So that was some of the evidence that started to think that they must be from sewage. And then we worked with organisations up and down the east coast of Australia that help us prove that they were. We started to see actually the 6 millimeter pieces and the 5 millimeter pieces, which I'll tell you what they are in a second, how they'll prove they're from sewage. The first thing we had to do is work out what they were compared to all the other white sticks that were washing in or being left as litter. I'm happy to answer questions about this later. I just want to talk obviously about the white sticks coming from sewage. So of these items, we had to work out, are they coming from stormwater, sewage, or from litter in the actual place, like someone's actually dropped it at that beach. So some of the things we looked at, there was some were obviously coming from stormwater, like the bin plugs when Randwick Council changed their bins to FOGO. There are some things on the right-hand or left-hand screen, what you're looking at is things like from the construction industry. Some are from stormwater, but a lot of them are also coming from our sewage systems. So how are they coming from our sewage systems? Well, we had to look at the main item that we were looking at were the white sticks, and we compared them to lollipop sticks because lollipops could be littered at the beach. And what we did find was there were so many more of the cotton buds, the PCBs, the plastic cotton bud sticks versus the lollipops. So we looked at location, quantity, the features of them, when it might be happening. And we classified them and we started to work out that there was actually more of them at ocean sites, and at the ocean sites that were near the outfalls. And primarily where I am, we have, as Dr. Ian talked about, we have a outfall at Potter Point at Kurnell, but there's also across the bay, Malabar, that is a primary treatment where 90% of Sydney's sewage goes. So we had to try and work out, we thought originally it was coming from primary treatment, but we worked out actually no, the ones that were near us, many of them were coming from our tertiary treatment. So if you have a look here, here's just some sites where I'll just move to this next slide, where you can see Potter Point is where the Cronulla tertiary system is, and then across the bay is Malabar. And the two sites are literally just under Potter Point, two main sites, and then one on the inside of Kurnell. So we had to do a lot more research into how are these getting through the tertiary system, because I was under the understanding that tertiary was amazing. 2003, we had solved all the problems locally. The seagrass was dying and the seaweed was dying because of ocean outfall pollution, but magically turning into tertiary treatment, we'd solved all the problems. But from finding all this stuff washing up our beaches, I've discovered that even through a tertiary system, we are letting anything smaller than 6 millimeters into the ocean. So we are literally treating the ocean like a sewage dump.
30 seconds.
So just very quickly, the proof, these are the step filters. So the buds fall straight through. And if they go across, they get broken up into those 6 millimeters and 5 millimeter pieces. So I won't go too much more about outfalls because obviously people have talked about this before, but just a quick run through here again, you can see the evidence that we're talking about. So the indentations from falling when they go across the filters, the fat, oil and grease. So the fat, oil and grease from our sewage systems. And here's some really good idea. You can see the indentations there. So that was proof that they were coming through our sewage systems. So I guess to kind of finish up why this has led me into supporting COF and recycled water is if we are looking at recycled water as drinking water, as potable water, then we are forced to treat it to a better level than what they are treating it now, because the idea that we can flush all this stuff out to sea, so anything smaller than 6 millimeters, so obviously I'm talking about physical plastics here, means eventually we're going to be drinking that effect anyway. So that's obviously put a simple explanation of how I see it, but this stuff is going out to sea. We're going to be drinking this crap for a long time. So we need to really start thinking about what we actually are flushing out to the oceans and using our water so much better. And obviously I've learned through Clean Oceans Foundation just how much money and how much waste is from things like sewage and desal. It just beggars belief we're here in 2023 and we're still having these, we have to have these discussions.
5 seconds.
So where we obviously think about education. Obviously people shouldn't be using sewage incorrectly. We shouldn't be flushing these things down the toilet like oils and plastics. But at the same time, yes, we can ban these things. But if anything smaller than 5 millimeters is getting through, we need to start looking at treating our water a lot better. So I'm going to kind of finish on there. I've said these ideas before in this presentation is, we're wasting our time picking up this waste and we're going to have this effect forever. It's a health issue. Have we not learned from the past? And yes, recycled water must be the way forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you. You did extraordinarily well to get those slides and your messages in that time. Thank you so much. I'll get you to stop sharing.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got a few questions here at the end. And just if you've got any more questions that you'd like to ask, please add them into the group map, but we can also go to people if we've got some time. So my first question is for you, Ian. And the question is simply, how do we take the community with us?
Firstly, listening to talks like Sarah Jo's, that was fantastic, Sarah Jo. Has anyone here tried to get information out of the water industry? I used to work at Sydney Water for nearly 20 years. It took me 3 months to get data on how much sodium is in the water. I've got to say, West Australia, South Australia, you're much better. But it is like getting state secrets. Do you want to work out how much of our sewage is actually recycled? My God, that is almost impossible. So we need a much better narrative. We've actually got to share the problems, be honest about it, and also measure and share the successes, in my view.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks, Ian. Right, Laurie, there's a question for you around what do you see are the key pieces of research that provide strong evidence of the impact of wastewater on the resilience of marine and waterway ecosystems?
Wow, that is a big question.
It is a big one.
I think the better way to answer that is to say that the way to understand what the impact of a particular pollutant is to have information before and after. And my understanding is that that's very rarely the case, where there is a sufficient amount of data before something has happened and after. I know the experience down here with our water authority, they were trying to push the view that there was no detectable change in the ecosystems directly out of, around the outfall across the time they used it, implying that they had before and after, but they simply don't. And this comes back to what I said before. The ocean is a place that we don't have a deep understanding. We haven't had enough time to do a lot of the research. Can I just digress from that? Because there's one thing that I would like to add to this.
Very quickly, and then we're going to go to one more question.
Yeah, okay. The problem that we have with the ocean and that commons issue is, and the lesson from that is, the solutions are not scientifically based. What we have is a social problem, and the solution to the problem is a social problem. We can throw as much money to the research as we want, but if people don't listen, it doesn't make any difference.
Thanks, Laurie. And you're getting some thumbs up there as well. So Robert, I can see your question, and I'm going to put this to see, Boyd, if you've got a response to this, and then Sarah Jo as well, because you do come from different angles as well. But Robert, you talk about Australia as a dry country, that the mini catchments are now profoundly altered by water harvesting. And you, in your mind, it's inevitable that we need an endless increase in our water supply. And you're asking the question, can recycled water alone solve this problem? Just wondering, Sarah, Jo, and Boyd, if you've got a response to that, or you can ask one of your friends.
Could I have a little go, Lyndall, please?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. In the cost benefit analysis of moving from primary to secondary up to tertiary, did with John, we found there that the amount of water that would be recycled through that process, and under a classical cost benefit analysis, there was, $12 to $28 billion of net benefit, so to Australia. But that would probably result in around about 64% of Australia's urban water use then coming online. So there is a capacity there. We're talking today with some experts around efficiency of water use too, and recycling has to be part of that solution. We do, I think, need to address our GDP growth and a fixation on growth. In some parts of the country, you know, small towns are suffering, while in others, that's not necessarily the case. But in any case, there's this pursuit of GDP growth at all costs, and I think we need to revise that. And inevitably, that involves population growth as well, which is both are very difficult questions politically, but inevitably that's what will occur. You know, our population growth, despite COVID, is large and significant. It's also the concentration of population as well, which is potentially part of the problem as well. But many would argue, you know, with economies of scale and having large recycling systems, that might be the solution. So it's quite a complex issue, but I think you know, recycling will go some way. You know, 64% of current urban water use will come online if we're able to move our primary and secondary treatment plants up to tertiary.
Thank you.
But John's got
his hand up, but then I also wanted to just, before we go to you, John, I wanted to see if Sarah Jo had anything to add to that question as well.
I guess I kind of come from a point where at the moment I'm on the East Coast where we've had a lot of rain. And that meant we've also had other issues. We're not dry, but we can't use a lot of the water that's actually in our area at the moment because of all the sediment and the pollution. So I guess I add a question to that. Yes, we're a dry country, but when we do have a lot of water, how would recycled water means that we can make that better? Because that's another eye-opener for me at the last few months about how much water we can't actually use because of the floods. And I guess my understanding of it is moving forward, our recycled systems mean we can utilise a lot more water than we are at the moment, especially the amount of water that we're flushing out to sea every day. I'll let John and some of the experts probably talk about in that way, but that's my thing at the moment. I was like, I didn't realise how much water we can't use when we've had all these downpours.
Thanks, Sarah Jo. John?
Yeah, I like the analogy at the moment. I think we've got like a tap and a basin, and we've got the plug out of the hole, and we're trying to keep the basin full. So if you can imagine that's what's going on at the moment. Whereas if you can plug it up, stopper it up, and reduce it, then you've got that much more. And we like to think that, you know, if you've got a water system that's recycling, you've almost got a dam in the water system at the moment that you're continually collecting water from. And also, I think I'd probably pass to the water experts on this, but I would suspect that if you had a recycled system in times of heavy rain, if you don't get contamination of that system, you've got a system that's recycling that water and that's safe to use. So it's sort of kind of a hedging your bets a bit in flooding time too. But I think maybe John Poon might know more about that than me.
Okay, we're not going to have time for a really in-depth conversation about this, but Simon, I can see your hand up, and I'm going to then, after you pause it, and we're just going to ask this one more question of everyone that will spend the last 5 minutes working through, well, what's next? How do we bring, and I think you've mentioned it, Maggie, the social license in this going forward. Simon?
Very, very, very quickly. At the end of the Millennium Drought, we had a set target of most states recycling 20% of our water, which we didn't meet. So that meant 80% of our wastewater was being thrown away. So we've got 80% more we could bring back into that loop. And the additional bit, going back to what Sarah was saying, 2011, Brisbane had a huge flood event, which I was in, and all our treatment plants suffered because there was so much sediment coming down, they couldn't treat the water. Whereas if we were recycling water, most of that recycled water would have been able to go back into the system. In fact, was, because they turned the recycling water systems back on to help us clean up all the flooded areas.
Okay. Thanks, Simon. Nice and succinct. Love it. So, and I think, Maggie, as I said, you're kind of going there with your question that you've got on the group map about the social license. So we're not going to break into groups. We won't have time, but let's just have a very quick conversation, and Jody will move us along in the group map. But wanting to think around, what do you think are the next steps to progress a community decision on using purified recyclable water? So with the group map, you can add your comments. We can give you a minute or two to add them in. we can also then share some of the ideas. And if you want to come off mute, you can pop your hand up and add comment to this. This isn't just about the people that we've had speaking. So if you've got a comment, you've been sitting there and listening from a community perspective, how do we take this forward? What's next? Yes, Laurie, I can see you waving.
I think we need to get a much better understanding of how everything works. The community needs to understand that the oceans do need water. You can't just take it away. So if you're going to start taking water out of rivers like the Murray, you're going to muck it up. And equally, you can't have too much. So having a broader understanding, there needs to be an education process that teaches everybody not to make those sorts of mistakes where water is running out to the ocean. It's a waste, because it's not.
I mean, thanks, Laurie. Sarah Jo, you spoke very passionately about what you thought and felt when you saw the data and the results from what you found. What do you see as the next steps in reaching a community decision?
I think those simple facts of making everybody understand. Like, I come from a marine science background, and even I thought that we didn't have a problem with sewage, or I thought recycled water was going to be too hard, too expensive, too polluting versus what we're already doing. And then obviously through my journey, I realized we shouldn't be doing what we've been doing in the past few decades. So I think it's more getting that knowledge out there, because one, exactly, the real water cycle, what are we really doing? What are the real costs? So talking about the tragedy of the commons, most people don't realize what the true cost of what we're already doing is. And then linking it to everyday events. So, we've already talked about this one about the flood. For me, that was a really good learning curve of understanding that all because we've got this amount of water doesn't mean it's free and easy to use for us to drink. So recycled water is almost a no-brainer, whether we're looking at drought, costs, or flood. So I think it's just getting back down to the basics. People don't know most of this stuff. They've just got no idea. And some of it's hidden on purpose. Like, I'll stop now because I know we're running out of time, but talking about getting information from, for example, Sydney Water, they were trying to tell us that all these cotton buds were coming from stormwater, from people putting the buds into their bins. Well, that was just a blatant lie. So I'm not going to, start a fight about that. But that's, that was just one hurdle. Like, they knew it was costing them money to clean out the buds. So I think it's the honesty and getting people to actually understand what's really happening.
So better information that's coming from a trusted source.
Yeah,
and that it's genuine and sharing. So I'd imagine that Ian, I mean, you're the science communicator here as well, making sure that the information is available and in an accessible format for people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was actually inspired by the point Simon made about reaching a target of 20% recycling. I think California is currently going for 80 because they are in absolute crisis. But why don't the Bureau of Meteorology, I love that website, why don't they have state-by-state comparisons, city-by-city comparisons? How are we going? And people want to share this. People want to share the sustainability journey that we're on. And the water industry needs to include things like that and celebrate the successes, but also talk about the problems.
Thank you. John, I'm going to come to you in a second. Andrea, I know you had your hand up, so I'm going to give you a moment too. Would you like to come off mute and say what you had to say there?
Yeah, I was briefly just going to second Ian's point there about taking people on the sustainability journey. And I think that involves political leadership. I think that our political class have shied away from this issue and they haven't shown the kind of leadership that they can. Anastasia Palaszczuk should be standing up there drinking a glass of purified water to show that it's safe. Before implementing maybe a short-term trial, a small-scale trial, like they did in Western Australia. Actually, they didn't ask people, they just went ahead and did it because such was the level of need. And people come to realise that the sky isn't going to fall in like in Singapore. It's going to be quite safe as long as we have the research to support it. And once, if you combine that with a public education campaign that shows that purified recycled water is very often cleaner than the water we get out of our dams and our groundwater, I think people will come along on the journey. But we need that political class to show the kind of leadership that's required. Thank you.
Thank you. And look, I just want to recognise there's a few comments in the chat. There's a resource there from David and Louise, and Robert, you've made the comment around that who and the how do we start an education program. I'm going to throw to you, John, for the last words, and I think you added 1 or 2 comments in the group map as well. So John, over to you.
I think there's lots of things. Go to our policy document. That's got a number of recommendations and some really innovative stuff. And this is part of it. This is a pilot. We would like government to say, gee, they did a good job. We shouldn't be doing this, and they could do it properly because they've got more money. Now, and apart from that, as a plug, the other thing too is connecting the fact that the oceans and the rivers will thank us, and that's a social license. And that's something, unfortunately, water treatment plants and water authorities don't like to talk about, because they're a business and they don't like to air their dirty linen. Everybody understands that. Whatever business is, that's okay. But the community needs that voice, and we need that voice lifted, because we don't have the money or the resources of other players in the game.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Look, we're at time. John, back to you again. Are there any last words that you would like to just say as next steps from tonight's session?
Well, let's see, we'll be putting this online. We've also just quickly, we've got an expression of support from ALP Victorian Senator Linda White now in Hanson. So we will continue to badger people in politics on all sides of the fence, and any support you can give us in any way, shape or form, we will gratefully accept. And that is the way that we can continue the journey.
Yeah, thanks, John. And just thanks to Clean Ocean Foundation for bringing us all together tonight as well. Now, before we finish off, for those who did do the pre-survey, now's your time to do the post-survey. So I'll leave the QR code up there for 30 seconds. And Jody, if you could put the link in the chat for us. We also thought it would be good. So those who have signed up and attended tonight, you'll get, as soon as we've worked the recording for this session, we'll send that out to you and you'll get a copy of it, is my understanding, John, and we'll also share it on different socials. We are going to also, if anyone wants to stay behind to do just a very quick Vox Pop video, and it will be with myself, just very quickly. We've got a few quick questions just to capture behind the scenes. If you want to stay online, please stay on at the end of the session. It will only take 5 minutes. And we can, just let me know. And last but not least, I would like to thank everyone for coming today. Sorry. And the speakers, a really big round of applause for everyone who spent their time coming into tonight. I think there was lots of different views and different perspectives that really shone through our speakers this evening. And thank you all to those who asked the questions and just joined in tonight's session. We've got a bit of a thing at the end of Mosaic Lab that we do a bit of a noisy goodbye. So if you're happy to bring on your videos, come off mute, and everyone can do a bit of a bye, wave your hands. And thanks all for coming in.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Well done, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks.
Well done. All right, we can stop recording.